Slavery. No freedom, no rights. For sale, human beings. It's too awful to seem real, but it was. From the earliest days of the American colonies through the mid-1860s, nearly 250 years, many American families owned slaves. A slave is a person who is held as the property of another person. Slaves in America were human beings taken from Africa. They were bought and sold the same way horses and wagons were bought and sold. Slaves were given no legal rights. They had to do whatever their owners told them to do, and many suffered at the hands of their brutal owners. All slaves, no matter how they were treated, suffered because they had no freedom. In 1808, Congress made it illegal to bring any more people from Africa to be slaves, but slavery continued for those already here and their children. Why would anyone own slaves? That's easy. There was hard work to be done, and lots of it. Slaves received no pay for their work, so they were a cheap form of labor. A slave owner had to invest whatever money it took to keep the slaves alive. Slavery was the practice of owning human beings. It developed mainly in the southern colonies, where huge plantations of tobacco, cotton, and rice required lots of workers. Plantation owners used slaves for farm labor and household help. In southern cities, slaves did all kinds of jobs that involved physical labor. In the northern colonies, slavery did not become widespread because people made a living on smaller farms or by trading or manufacturing goods. Even so, plenty of smaller households in both the North and the South had one or two slaves that they used as servants. How was slavery defended? People defended slavery in one of two ways. Some people thought slavery was a necessary evil, something we needed even though we didn't like it. Others thought slavery was actually a good thing that helped everyone involved. Here are 4 ways that people justified slavery. Examples of pro-slavery thinking. Don't make me do that. We have to have slavery so there's someone to do the yucky work no one else wants to do. No pain, no gain. We believe slavery in America is teaching Africans to be better people, which will be good for them in the long run. Tiger by the tail. We want to let the slaves go, but we're afraid what will happen if we do, so we won't. For their own good. We think black people are so inferior that actually keeping them enslaved helps them. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, and that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. U.S. Declaration of Independence, 1776. Freedom and equality, but not for all. The United States was founded on liberty and equality, but to early Americans these principles had to do with establishing a government ruled by citizens instead of a king. The first Americans didn't even believe all citizens should have a say in government, just those who were white, male, and owned land. The U.S. Constitution was written to ensure liberty and equality, yet it also allowed slavery. Even though many Americans thought slavery was wrong, the South had relied on slave labor for a very long time. Those states would never have voted to approve the Constitution if slavery was outlawed. Constitutional compromise. When the Constitution was adopted, it said this: Congress had to wait until 1808, 20 years before passing a law to make it illegal to import slaves into the United States. Slaves who escaped to a state where slavery was illegal did not become free. If their owners claimed them, they had to be returned. And to calculate a state's population, slaves counted as 3/5 of a person. Population determined how many representatives a state got in Congress. Yeah, that's still in the Constitution. Friends of freedom. Many people in the United States opposed slavery. Abolitionists were people who wanted slavery ended permanently or abolished. Most abolitionists lived in northern states where slavery wasn't as popular, but some Southerners were abolitionists too. Abolitionists put pressure on politicians to end slavery, and they worked to convince society that slavery was morally wrong. They did this by forming groups, holding conventions, giving speeches and sermons, handing out pamphlets, and even publishing newspapers and songs. A deadly revolt. One Virginia night in 1831, Nat Turner and several other slaves crept into the house where their owners slept and murdered the entire family. They went to other houses and killed even more white people. More slaves joined Turner, and they killed at least 55 people before they were stopped. Turner and many others were executed for these murders, and angry white mobs murdered nearly 200 black people afterwards. People blamed Turner's rebellion partly on his education. Virginia responded by passing a law making it illegal to teach black people to read and write. Don't like it? Sue me. Another slave, Dred Scott, took a different approach. Scott's owner moved often and took Scott with him to each new residence. Because of that, Scott had lived in both free and slave states. In 1846, he sued for his freedom. He argued that because his owner had taken him to live where slavery was illegal, he should be free. Scott's case went all the way to the United States Supreme Court, but he didn't win. In the Dred Scott decision, the Supreme Court ruled that black people were not citizens and had no right to sue in the first place. All right, let's go through these very quickly. Let's start with A, choose the right word, check the words that correctly complete each sentence. I'm going to do the first one with you. A slave or abolitionist is a person who is held as property of another person. Well, I'd hope we'd know this one because that was a vocab term with slavery. That is a slave. Slave owner had to invest enough money to keep slaves healthy or alive. Everybody knows about the plight of slaves. They only got enough to keep them alive. Do the other ones. That one's pretty straightforward. What did Nat Turner and Dred Scott have in common? Decide whether each statement describes Turner, Scott, or both. Write the letter of each description in the correct part of the diagram. So Nat Turner and Dred Scott, let's start with A. He was a slave. Well, both of them were slaves. That's me trying to write an A. That's an A. B, he lived in slave states. Well, it's Nat Turner spent most of his life in Virginia, so he only got to live in slave states. But actually, I am wrong there. That is a both, because they both did live in slave states. But what was unique about Dred Scott is he also got to live in free states. So there we go. We have A, B, and C done. There's definitely going to be several similarities. So just go ahead and work through that one. Identify him. I'll just give you this one right now. Who do you think this drawing is most likely showing? Well, I'm guessing because he's holding a blade and he's going against the guy with a rifle, it would be the one who led a rebellion, and that was Nat Turner and Nat Turner's rebellion. And the way it really, for Part D, in the Bill of Rights, the Fifth Amendment says this: no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. How would this amendment sound if it were described the way things really were? Rewrite it here. So obviously, not everyone, especially not Dred Scott, was treated with equality under the law. So I want you to go ahead and look at that one on your own and rewrite it to describe the way things really were, especially in the face of slavery. Look at Part E, trading places. If Lincoln could have made slaves and owners trade places for one day, like he says in his quote, where if someone says they like slavery, that they should have to try it out themselves, there are some things that owners would not be able to realize what it would be like to be a slave for an entire lifetime. So what are some of the things that you couldn't get from just one day? Well, something like having an inability to read and write, you're not going to get that just after one day. You can't all of a sudden not read and write. So it would be unfair to say you'd understand what it's like to be a slave if you only did it for one day. Same thing with trauma of past experiences. Many slaves were split up from family and were left on their own. So that would be another thing that would not be able to be addressed in one day. So again, mark everything that could not be traded for just one day. What did it mean to have no rights? Match each cause with an effect to learn about a few tragic consequences of slavery. Let's look at cause number one. Slaves did not have a right to a fair trial. Well, if we look at C, slaves accused of a crime could be sentenced with little or no evidence. So they were already, if we go back to the last page and look at the Fifth Amendment, they weren't having their Fifth Amendment rights fulfilled because, like the name of this activity, no freedom, no rights. Slaves were not protected by laws that protected citizens. So let's look at this one. So it means that they didn't have access to normal laws. Well, a lot of times it really meant that owners could do whatever they wanted to their slaves. So we're going to look at something like that. We're going to put an E right there. And I want you to do those last three on your own. And then the last thing, mark it up. Look at this timeline of anti-slavery laws. Circle the actions that happen at the state level, box the actions that happen at the federal government level. So we're looking for things that are going against slavery. Let's look at something that has to do with a state. Well, I know that Massachusetts is a state. In 1783, the Massachusetts Supreme Court declares slavery unconstitutional. I'm going to circle that. So look for ones that have a specific state. All right, I'm going to look for something that has to do with the federal action. Well, I know President Lincoln was president. That means he was head of the federal government. And I see the Emancipation Proclamation, and it's freeing the slaves. That's definitely anti-slavery. I'm going to put a box around this one. So you're going to be looking for specific examples of each. Which ones are made by state? So you're looking for a specific state name. You're also going to be looking for things like Congress or amendment or United States. Usually that means it's going to be talking about the federal government. So go ahead and do that activity on your own. Again, go ahead and complete all of these. It's just a review for the lesson that we had. And please take your time. You've got the full class period. Make sure you work through all of these. If you have any questions, like always, please just raise your hand and ask so I am able to help you.